Kill the valiant, the bold, the manly, and the fine Tanguts, and let the soldiers take for themselves as many of the common Tanguts as they can lay their hands on and capture. In the year 1227, Chinggis Khan ordered the extermination of the Tangut Xia Empire, who had tents of thin woolen cloths, who had camels laden with goods, maiming and taming the mothers, fathers, down to the offspring of their offspring. While I take my meals, you must talk about the killing and destruction of the Tanguts, and say, maimed and tamed, they are no more. So, who were the Tanguts? How in the world were they able to incur the complete unbridled wrath of the great Chinggis Khan of the Mongol Empire? Well, I'm sorry to say that they are actually not exceedingly special. Besides the fact that they narrowly survived getting genocided by the Mongols. They were not as technologically and economically advanced as their contemporary, the Han-led Song dynasty, nor were they as militarily superior as the Khitan Liao dynasty or the Jurchen Qin dynasty. But their rise from a virtually unknown little tribe to a medium-sized empire was quite inspirational, despite them being mediocre at everything. That's why they had to learn, adapt, and do a bit of, backstabbing to survive. And boy were there lots of knives sticking out of people's back. The story of their rise is practically a survival guide for your average, not so remarkable civilization to survive in a chaotic world. But of course, since we can see how they eventually ended up, something obviously went terribly wrong for them. So in this episode, we will learn about the successes and failures of the Tangut Empire building project. The Tangut people were recorded into history as early as the Sui dynasty, the short-lived dynasty that preceded China's Tang dynasty. The Chinese name for them was Tangxiang. Tangut was actually what the Mongols called them, though the word may have Turkic roots. The name they used to refer to themselves, their endonym, was something like Minya. As they are more commonly known as Tangut nowadays, I will refer to them by that name to prevent confusion. Yep, this is one of those cases where the victors get to write the history. The Tanguts were considered to be one among the many branches of the Qiang people, or more specifically, Western Qiang. Qiang had historically been the designation for people that's been living around the northwestern part of China since around 3,000 years ago. Their name had appeared in the oracle bones. But since tribal identity was very fluid, and these semi-nomadic pastoralists intermixed with various people, it is not known if they are completely related to those ancient people. Making their identity even more complicated, the ruling clan of the Qiang was surnamed Tuoba. And if you watch earlier videos, you would know that Tuoba was the surname of the ethnic Xianbei royal clan that ruled northern China during the Northern Wei dynasty, which coincidentally was also the setting for the Ballad of Mulan. In the Khitan Liao history book, they believe that the Tangut Tuoba was related to the Wei dynasty's Tuoba. There are only circumstantial evidence that they might be related, though it didn't stop the Tanguts from using this interpretation to their advantage. Because, for one thing, the Tanguts were quite prolific at assuming royal surnames of Chinese dynasties. When they pledged allegiance to the Tang dynasty in the early 7th century, they were given the Li surname, the surname of the Tang dynasty royal family. And a few centuries later, they would be given the Zhao royal surname when they pledged allegiance to the Chinese Song dynasty. The Tanguts would eventually establish their own empire in 1038, but in the early days of their history, they were very small and insignificant, especially when compared to their powerful neighbors, the Tibetan Empire and the Tang dynasty. Originally, they were allied by marriage to the Tuyuhun people, who themselves were originally a splinter of the Xianbei people who conquered the local Qiang people in the 3rd century. As the Tuyuhun ruler died in 635, the Tanguts jumped ships and submitted to the Tang dynasty for the first time. This is when they were first bestowed the Li royal surname by the Tang dynasty, although they didn't use it until it was closer to the end of the dynasty. And since they are on the Tang Dynasty side, they became enemies with the growing Tibetan Empire. And by the late 7th century, they were pushed eastward and settled into China. This is when the Tanguts started to adopt some sedentary agricultural practices from the local Han Chinese and surrounding people. You just have to be flexible enough to adapt and survive. In the middle of the 8th century, after the Tang Dynasty suffered the devastating catastrophe of the Anlushan Rebellion, China was threatened by the Tibetan Empire. This is when some of the Tanguts switched side to the Tibetans to occupy the Tang capital, Chang'an briefly. The Tanguts would eventually be divided into two factions. One was pro-Tang and the other pro-Tibetan, and it kinda helped them survive because both of the great empires found them to be useful pawns. The pro-Tang Tanguts cleverly remained loyal to the Tang Dynasty as it grew its influence. For their defense of the empire during Huang Cao's rebellion, the Tuoba clan, now using the Li surname, was rewarded with the appointment as Jiedusi, or military governor of Dingnan. As Jiedusi, they were officially employed by the court, but in reality, they are functionally independent. This territory may seem small, but it will serve as their invaluable base for expansion in the future. Keep in mind that not all Tanguts were on their side, and there were other ethnicities under their rule too. After the Tang Dynasty fell, China entered the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, and 5 successive dynasties controlled northern China during that time. The Tuoba clan just showed allegiance to whichever dynasty was in charge in succession. They first supported later Liang, even fighting for them. But when their patron was losing, they switched side to the next rising power, later Tang. Naturally, later Tang didn't quite trust the Tanguts, and they tried to replace them with another administrator. Not wanting to lose their base, they mounted an effective defense against their potential replacements, and after winning, they cleverly sent an envoy to apologize for their action. In the end, they get to keep their territory. They just continued this same pattern of switching allegiance all the way through later Jin, later Han, later Zhou, and even to Song Dynasty. You know, as they say, never outshine the master. That's why they were pretty much left unscathed while the various empires and kingdoms fought over China. But in 982, trouble started to brew. The Tangut ruler, Li Jipeng, and other more Sino-sized Tangut elders handed over the control of their territory to the Song Dynasty, in exchange for a luxurious life in the Song capital. At the time, Song Dynasty had this policy of offering their rival kingdoms rich, luxurious life in exchange for their country. A lot of their rivals took the option, and Li Jipeng was not an exception. His brother, however, Li Jiqian, rebelled against the decision and resisted the Song Dynasty. His faction was able to carve out more territory in northwestern China and gained power by reincorporating the other Tangut clans. Then he made an alliance with Song Dynasty's arch-nemesis, the Qin Liao Dynasty, while at the same time pursuing peace with Song Dynasty too. By playing both sides, they were able to get the Song Dynasty to award them the control of the Dingnan territory back. The wily Tanguts were masters at playing the different sides to their advantage. But even they know that they couldn't last like this forever. So, for the next few generations, they concentrated on growing their own power base. This project was continued by his son, Li Deming, and his grandson, Li Yuanhao. They expanded westward, taking over the Uyghur and fractured Tibetan territories after the fall of the Tibetan Empire. Unlike his father, Li Yuanhao was a lot more ambitious, and he wanted to strengthen the Tangut cultural identity, separating themselves from the Song. First, he ordered all his subjects to shave their heads in the Tangut fashion, around the year 1034. Then he declared independence in 1038, establishing the Xia, or Western Xia Empire. He changed his surname to Wei Ming and ordered the creation of the Tangut script. He practically solidified the Tangut Xia culture all by himself. The creation of a national cultural identity is a very important move in empire building. It is a glue that would bind disparate people together. One of the first things the Tibetan, Khitan, Jurchen, and Mongols did when they established their empire were the creation of their own writing system and systematized their own language. Despite this, the Xia Empire would remain multi-ethnic, with Tangut, Chinese, and Tibetan language remaining to be part of their official language. This creation of a mainline Tangut culture solidified their position in history. At least whatever was left of it after the Mongols were done with them. Through the existence of their empire, they had never been strong enough to seriously challenge the military might of the Khitan Liao dynasty nor the economic prowess of Song dynasty. But at least they were hardy enough to defend their territory from being taken over by their rivals. When the Jurchen Qin Dynasty took over the Khitans, the Tanguts will also submit to the Jurchens while keeping their ties with the Song. This is just their shtick, man. Their mediocrity saved them from becoming the main target of their two main rivals, while at the same time they are plotting against them at the back. As this equilibrium was maintained, the Tanguts were able to develop its own distinct culture. While they harkened back to their pastoralist past, they also became significant producers of grain as agriculturalists. They translated Buddhist and Confucian texts into the Tangut script, developed their own clothing style, built their distinct beehive-shaped royal tombs, camel rearing becoming a significant part of their culture, and so on. The point is, the Tanguts had a good thing going for them. That's why, when Chinggis Khan unified the Mongols into an empire, they weren't too worried at first. After a series of probing raids, Chinggis Khan launched a large campaign against the Tanguts in 1209. Unsurprisingly, the Tanguts were defeated in 2010, and they swore allegiance to the Mongols. As Mongol vassals, they even turned against the Jurchens, who refused to help them fight the Mongol invasions earlier. The war with the Jurchen Qin dynasty proved to be costly and unpopular for the Tanguts. That's why when Chinggis Khan ordered them to send an army to assist the Mongols on their western expedition sometime before 1219, the Tanguts refused to send anything, and their general, Asa Gambu, even mocked the Mongol envoy. Since Chinggis Khan's force are incapable of subjugating others, why did he go as far as becoming a Khan? Oh, those were fighting words. Chinggis won't forget this. Once he returned from his expedition, he will send a punitive expedition against the Tanguts. And in 1225, he did just that. However, an unfortunate accident happened. According to the secret history of the Mongols, while the Mongol army was marching, the 63-year-old Chinggis Khan fell off his horse during a hunt. He suffered serious injuries. The Mongols considered to withdraw their army, but it would be a massive embarrassment if they did. It would look as if they are scared of the Tanguts. So they sent an envoy to the Tanguts to gauge their reaction. If they were sufficiently apologetic, then they can withdraw without losing face. But I didn't mock your envoy, the Tangut emperor said. It was me. The Tangut general Azagampu stepped forward and challenged the Mongols to battle. Well, that's it. That boast sealed the fate of the Tanguts. Now Chinggis Khan just can't back away from this fight anymore. Even though we may die, let us challenge their boast. Despite his condition, Chinggis Khan obliterated the Tangut Xia Empire. They did the best they can to wipe them from history. And that was the last thing Genghis did before he died in the same year. Well, this is what happens when you get too cocky and don't have the ability to back it up. Some Tanguts survived the destruction, as evidenced by the Tangut scripts from around the early 1500s were discovered. However, there was nothing more past that, as their civilization faded into obscurity. Their history could only be pieced together from the accounts of neighboring nations and archaeology. That's why information about them is hard to come by, and it led to a whole discipline that specializes in studying them, called Tangutology. Anyway, if you want more contents on cool histories and literature, press the subscribe button. Press the like button and comment if you can to boost the algorithm. I would also like to thank my patrons on Patreon for making this video possible. Until next time, stay cool my bros.